Good afternoon, I'm Dennis Vitorian, and this is the 25th Hour. In this week's news for the week of October 25th, the city is still seeing rising coronavirus numbers, but is more stable than in March. The Board of Elections is under fire for early voting mishaps, and Election Day is right around the corner. Look out for an upcoming live cast covering election night returns on Tuesday, November 3rd, starting at 9 p.m. Things may have changed by the time you hear this. Starting with de Blasio. Voters in New York City were met with long voting lines numerous days in a row despite early voting allowing voters a chance to try to avoid that very same situation on Election Day itself. Critics say that the Board of Elections had inadequate planning and didn't meet high voter enthusiasm matched with this presidential election year. Seeing as how there are only 88 voting sites to meet millions of voters, it comes as no surprise that there aren't enough locations to meet this presidential election. De Blasio called on the BOE to move out more voting machines and expand voting hours. After 3 days, data showed 700,000 people came out to vote. Early voting hours were also expanded to meet the rising demand. In Manhattan, the BOE granted one more extra early polling place to address long lines at Marymount Manhattan College. Workers from Macy's on 34th Street were seen boarding up their windows in anticipation of civil unrest after the election. After the NYPD didn't help things by warning of that same unrest, other Manhattan businesses boarded up plywood on their storefronts. 349 Manhattan voters received erroneous absentee ballots. The New York City BOE revealed that on Friday, just weeks after the same thing happened, where voters got envelopes with other voters' information in them. De Blasio himself waited on line for 3.5 hours at his early polling place to vote, calling for an overhaul of the Board of Elections afterwards.
Mayor de Blasio wants the state legislature to pass a bill that he says would make the board more professional and empower the executive director. He says the BOE should be bipartisan and functional, and he wants a constitutional amendment to fundamentally change it. In the meantime, he says the BOE should make more change for this weekend.
There's still time to increase the hours for early voting further, to get more machines over to the poll sites, to get more workers over there.
Only 26% of New York City students attend in-person classes, Mayor de Blasio announced, undermining those who are saying parents want their kids to return to physical school spaces. Despite finally reporting those numbers, hundreds of New York City schools are still not reporting in-person attendance. 421 schools didn't report their numbers, and 90 of which also didn't report their remote attendance. Following reporting by the Daily News, which pointed out the lack of internet in homeless shelters that would let homeless students get on remote learning, the city announced it plans to install Wi-Fi in city-run homeless shelters to address the lack of internet, but didn't provide a timeline. The city will target 200 family shelters out of the entire 450 shelter system. Considering the absence of students due to missing laptops can launch child welfare investigations, David Hansel, the head of the Administration for Children's Services, called for there to be a higher bar to launch investigations based on missing kids due to missing tech. A survey by Education Trust New York revealed that New York City students of color are less likely to return to school buildings this year compared to white students, opting more for a complete remote experience rather than a hybrid approach with students learning from school half the time. School's Chancellor Carranza said there might be more than one chance to switch over, but that information remains unclear. De Blasio said he was surprised more students didn't attend school in person. Even though one would expect de Blasio to make this announcement, Governor Cuomo was the one who announced that he would allow schools to reopen that are located in orange and red zones as long as they test all students and faculty. New York City exceeded 550 coronavirus cases in one day this week for the first time in months, breaking past the threshold set in August that would signify the seriousness of a second wave of the virus. Mayor de Blasio encouraged New Yorkers to avoid holiday travel as numbers keep rising. The city continues to record a steady rise in cases, but so far hospitals are not experiencing the same overwhelming number of patients it saw at the beginning of the pandemic, signaling lessons learned on how to handle a pandemic. New York City retail businesses will be allowed to sell outside their storefronts in an extension to the Open Streets and Open Restaurants program announced by de Blasio in an attempt to assist businesses that have reduced capacity inside their stores to prevent coronavirus infection. In a study by Partnership for New York, just 15% of Manhattan office workers are expected to return to their desks by the end of the year. De Blasio reached a deal with the city's largest municipal union to prevent thousands of layoffs and save the city millions of dollars. De Blasio agreed not to fire certain DC 37 union members until June 2021 in exchange for the city not paying into certain union funds. In Red Hook, police removed a table full of masks and flyers detailing prevention tips against COVID. On Sunday night, an NYPD officer used the cruiser's loudspeaker to scream Trump 2020 in reply to a provocative pedestrian.
Trump 2020. Put it on YouTube, put it on Facebook. Trump 2020.
The officer in question was suspended without pay as part of the NYPD's policy to keep officers apolitical. The NYPD officer who was caught on camera with his knee on a man's neck in May decided to resign instead of facing an internal departmental trial. Officer Francisco Garcia pinned Donnie Wright down when Wright wouldn't back up after Garcia yelled at him. The Manhattan DA was originally supposed to charge Wright with assault and resisting arrest, but after videos came out of Officer Garcia holding down Wright's neck with his knee, they dropped the charges. De Blasio called for prosecutions for violent protests in Brooklyn in relation to the death of Philadelphia native William Wallace Jr. Demonstrators lit fires and vandalized police cars Tuesday night. In good news, Juanita Holmes became the NYPD's first female chief of patrol this week, the first in the department's 175-year history. A caravan of Trump supporters drove past Manhattan and Brooklyn with anti-Trump demonstrators getting into fights with Trump supporters. Even Trump's personal lawyer Rudy Giuliani didn't escape the craziness, being cursed out as he was being driven away. Mayoral candidate Ray McGuire, the former Citigroup executive, has raised an impressive $1.1 million in just 10 days after announcing his entrance into the race. City Comptroller Scott Stringer has $2.3 million cash on hand, Brooklyn Borough President Eric Adams has $2.1 million, and the rest haven't broken into the millions. In the Manhattan DA's race, New York Law School professor Alvin Bragg was endorsed by prominent Harlem politicians, including former Congressman Charles Rangel, former Governor David Patterson, State Senator Robert Jackson, and former Manhattan Borough President Virginia Fields. The publication The City reported that the number of apartments containing kids in NYCHA buildings with lead-based paint will actually increase to 20,000 as investigations continue. Brooklyn Borough President Eric Adams, who's running for mayor, demanded assistance for NYCHA tenants after the lead paint discovery. The Queens District Attorney Melinda Katz had announced a partnership with Queens Defenders to start a new diversion program at the Rockaway Community Justice Center. Queens Borough President Sharon Lee announced that she is helping Queens hospitals increase the number of nurses specializing in sex assault care, bringing the number up to 28 nurses who can speak a total of 13 languages. The Republican candidate for Queens Borough President, Joanne Ariola, got in trouble for featuring 3 endorsements from prior borough presidents, the problem being that 2 of them are dead. 8 years after Hurricane Sandy, Queens is finally starting construction on 6 miles of storm surge protection along its waterfront. Public advocate Jumaane Williams was joined by environmental activists on Friday in calling for $200 million in improvements in Sunset Park to create an offshore wind energy manufacturing hub. There's a curious story this week involving de Blasio and the sale of the New York Mets to billionaire Steve Cohen. The mayor made it no secret that he's not a fan of Cohen, saying that selling the team to a billionaire has nothing to do with his, quote, personal feelings about the hedge fund chair. Since the city owns the land where the Mets Stadium sits, de Blasio claimed the city has the power to authorize a transaction to sell the team to Cohen. On Friday, the law department said it found nothing untoward in the sale and said the transaction can proceed. Moving on to the city council, a study commissioned by the city council found that white city workers make almost $7,600 a year more than black employees and $6,500 more than Asian workers. Former Queens, New York City Councilman Archie Spigner died on Thursday at the age of 92. Spigner represented his 27th district covering Jamaica, Southeast Queens, Springfield Gardens, and Hollis until 2001, spanning almost 30 years before term limits were instituted. He was instrumental in developing areas of Queens, helping with the Archer Avenue subway extension, JFK Air Train, the campus at York College, and high school for law enforcement and public safety. City Councilman Rory Lansman, who announced his resignation from the council at the end of September, said that he was transitioning into working for Cuomo's administration. Lansman will serve as special counsel for ratepayer protection. Cuomo has been more aggressive with utility companies for dragging their feet on repairs after storms hit, and Lansman will fulfill that role. Moving on to Governor Cuomo. Governor Cuomo criticized the City Board of Elections, saying that he would be in favor of an entire redesign of the agency after reports showed long lines and delays days in a row during early voting. One of Cuomo's top aides, his secretary Melissa DeRosa, posted her ballot on Instagram on Friday, spurring election lawyers to say that she broke the law since ballot selfies are illegal. More than 20% of New Yorkers have already voted, according to Gannett Albany. Cuomo continued to attack the Trump administration's handling of the COVID pandemic, most recently seizing on Trump Chief of Staff Mark Meadows' comments last weekend that the administration will not, quote, control the pandemic. California was added to the state quarantine list, joining 41 other states that people have to quarantine 14 days for if they recently came from there. State Attorney General Letitia James came to the governor's defense this week, saying that Cuomo didn't violate the law by delaying data on nursing home deaths. Outside groups are suing to attain that data, claiming the governor is hiding information that could show how the administration led to over 1,000 nursing home deaths at the outset of the pandemic. Cuomo announced that local governments can require masks for schools, spurred by a request by Westchester County's Executive George Latimer. The DOJ launched an inquiry into Cuomo's handling of nursing home deaths at the outset of the pandemic, with Cuomo saying the inquiry is politically timed with the election. The New York Times released a report about how, aside from nursing home residents having a tough time during the pandemic, Nursing home employees are also experiencing sickness and also job loss. State Comptroller Thomas DiNapoli issued a report this week recommending New York City come up with its own fiscal plan instead of relying on the state and criticized borrowing on credit. Cuomo himself said that he's waiting until after the election to make tough financial decisions involving the state's fiscal funding. The governor's office released a report on Friday that said the state will lose $63 billion in revenue through 2024. Disabled MTA commuters won't be able to use the new Omni system installed on MetroCard turnstiles until next fall, because the Touch and Go system won't be installed on entry gates until then. The authority is also starting to test thousands of workers per week for COVID, with the ultimate goal to test 15% of the MTA's frontline workers weekly. The MTA released a new report saying that service cuts would result in a loss of 450,000 jobs by 2022. The MTA is also going to move forward with a planned rate hike for LIRR rides. An Inspector General report came out that said the MTA uses paper timesheets to track worker hours and hands out overtime on an honor system, even after the MTA tried cracking down on overtime fraud and installed digital timekeeping clocks in facilities. In Buffalo, public schools finally won the victory of making sure every remote student receives a laptop or tablet, weeks after the start of the school year. State Attorney General Letitia James said that her office would review a complaint about the consulting work of former Republican candidate for governor and Westchester executive Rob Astorino. Westchester Democratic Chairwoman Suzanne Berger called for an investigation into a deal Astorino made with a developer to build on 60 acres of county land. Westchester County ethics laws prohibit a public official from accepting work or future employment within a year from any company that provided goods or services to the county during that official's tenure. A new seatbelt law goes into effect this Sunday, which requires passengers in the back seat to buckle up. If caught unbuckled, passengers are fined $50. Going on to Albany. New Yorkers for a Balanced Albany, a pro-charter school group, is pouring in $3 million to two Long Island Democrats, Laura Ahern and Kevin Thomas, in their races for the state Senate. City and State reported this week that New York State will see a supermajority of leftists elected to the state Senate, with the body being able to override Cuomo's veto if need be. However, Cuomo's influence and power, as well as a number of moderates seated alongside progressives, might limit the potential for the chamber to wrest political power from the governor. State Senator Michael Gianaris announced support for a bill that would increase the number of polling places in New York City in order to ease long lines at early voting sites. The state senator is also planning to introduce a bill that could provide relief to NYCHA families by paying their rent if they've experienced gas and electric outages. Moving on to the state courts. The NYCLU and Legal Aid Society sued de Blasio and the NYPD, saying there was a, quote, indiscriminate brutalizing of peaceful protesters, end quote, during demonstrations at the beginning of the year. The lawsuit cited 11 plaintiffs who took part in protests between May 28 and June 28, who were allegedly beaten with batons, sprayed with pepper spray, and subjected to a tactic called kettling when cops surround and charge protesters. The plaintiffs alleged they were jailed, not given food, water, medical aid, and that the cops weren't wearing masks when they were supposed to. The former legislative director for Assemblyman Peter Abate Jr., Joseph Brady, was arrested for sexually abusing an 18-year-old, possessing drugs, and allegedly bomb-making materials, according to the Times-Union, which continued to release a report on how Brady was a de facto biker gang leader, specifically the East Coast Syndicate. Brooklyn Supreme Court Justice Edgar Walker admonished the Kings County Democratic Committee for not holding an organizational meeting, not even a virtual one, where activists elect officers and adopt rules. The KCDC said that due to the pandemic, they couldn't hold a hearing, not even a virtual one, because of those who lack internet. The judge said that there is a bigger issue excluding those who could make it to the virtual meetings than those who can't, and ordered Chairwoman Rodney Bashad to hold a meeting within 45 days. Westchester County Supreme Court Judge Mary Smith denied a late request by Republican candidate Shel Farley to remove her from a mistaken ballot line, namely the Libertarian Party and the Save America Movement line, in the 18th Congressional District race against Sean Patrick Maloney, covering Orange and Putnam counties and parts of Dutchess and Westchester counties. Landlords in Brooklyn are hit with class action lawsuits by tenants because of alleged tricky math relating to calculating rent, especially after taking tax breaks in order to get around rent stabilization rules. A resident of the Lucerne Hotel joined a court challenge to force the city to move homeless men out of the Upper West Side Hotel. The Lucerne has been a battleground for Mayor de Blasio's homeless policies in the midst of the pandemic. Mayor de Blasio wanted to keep homeless single men at hotels in order to stave off the number of infected in the homeless population, but then the Upper West Side neighborhood lawyered up and created a group to specifically get the homeless single men out of the hotel, saying that they didn't want homeless shelters in their backyard. And this has been a flashpoint in de Blasio's homeless policy because he needs to decide where to put homeless people. Shelters are inadequate because there is no room to put people 6 feet away from each other to stave off infection. Moving on to President Trump, a Washington Post article reports how During Trump's 4 years as president, at least $8.1 million was directed to his businesses through taxpayer money and GOP politicians. Trump insisted that official government and political events took place at his club in Mar-a-Lago, located in Palm Beach, Florida. The federal government would charge upwards of $13,700 for guest rooms, almost $17,000 for food and wine, even $3 for cups of water. Vice President Mike Pence continued to campaign this week despite his chief of staff Mark Short and 4 other aides getting infected with coronavirus. Pence tested negative for the virus. As mentioned earlier, Trump's chief of staff Mark Meadows went on CNN's State of the Union on Sunday and said the administration would not control the pandemic.
So here's what we have to do. We're not going to control the pandemic. We are going to control the fact that we get vaccines, therapeutics, and other mitigation.
Why aren't we going to get control of the pandemic?
Because it is a contagious virus, just like the flu.
Yeah, but why not make efforts to contain it?
Well, we are making efforts to contain it.
By running all over the country, not wearing a mask?
Jake,
that's what the vice president's doing.
We can get into the back.
Trump's son-in-law Jared Kushner had his own gaffe this week when he said that Trump's policies are meant to address black Americans complaining and that the administration's work can't help those who don't want to succeed.
Thing we've seen in a lot of the black community, which is mostly Democrat, is that President Trump's policies are the policies that can help people break out of the problems that they're complaining about, but he can't want them to be successful more than they want to be successful.
Kushner was also the subject of a CNN article where it was revealed through a taped interview with journalist Bob Woodward that he said Trump was taking the country back from the doctors. The administration is, quote, woefully behind, quote, end quote, in stockpiling medical gloves, according to NBC News. The Department of Health and Human Services said that the federal government only has 2 million gloves when it set a goal of 4.5 billion gloves. Trump made the false assertion that counting mail-in ballots after Election Day is illegal. It's false. The president was also upset about Fox News airing Obama's campaigning against him, with Obama stepping up the rhetoric this week.
This week, with everything that's happening, you know what he brought up? He was fussing about the crowd size at the inauguration again, saying his was bigger. Who is thinking about that right now? Nobody except him.
20 Republican former U.S. attorneys publicly called Trump a threat to the rule of law in our country and endorsed Biden. Biden started shifting his strategy to campaign in states that were thought of as Democratic long shots, including Georgia and Texas. The two candidates are frequently visiting Pennsylvania as well, seen as a key state. On Tuesday night, Trump visited Omaha, Nebraska, giving a speech at a rally, and upon taking off, ended up stranding thousands of people because his campaign didn't charter enough buses to take rally-goers back to their cars. 7 people were sick with hypothermia. Trump announced that he might be holding an election night party at the White House instead of the Trump International Hotel in D.C., only leading to more people angry about mixing official government property and politics. A new weekly labor report revealed new GDP and unemployment numbers. 751,000 people filed weekly unemployment claims, a slight dip from 800,000. The U.S. GDP recovered by 33% annually thanks to a 7.4% increase this past third quarter. The GDP will have to increase by another 10% to be at the same level it started in the beginning of the pandemic. Miles Taylor, the former Deputy Chief of Staff for the Department of Homeland Security, revealed himself to be the person named Anonymous who in 2018 penned an op-ed about how they and others in Trump's administration were working to prevent Trump from carrying out certain self-harming policies. Anonymous went on to write a book called A Warning that described the president as undisciplined and amoral. Taylor had resigned from his position last year and endorsed Biden this past summer. Critics were slamming Taylor for being someone who, despite saying that they were protecting Trump from himself, was instrumental in carrying out the hardline immigration policies that this administration passed, including the migrant separation policy, which separated migrant children from their parents. A Wall Street Journal exclusive report detailed how the Trump administration is considering early biometric screening for those who are applying for visas in an attempt to track immigrants who want to stay in the country. The plan would ostensibly create a biometric database of people in the federal government. NBC News reported that if Trump wins a second term, Stephen Miller will put in place an even more aggressive immigration agenda, which includes limiting asylum grants, punishing sanctuary cities, expanding the travel ban, and placing new limits on work visas. A New York Times investigation revealed that migrant children from other countries were handed off to Mexican authorities, violating U.S. child welfare policy. The children were sent to countries without an accompanying adult, usually in places they have no experience in and no family ties. Trump's federal salary advisor Ron Sanders quit on Monday over Trump's executive order reclassifying workers so that they can be easily fired without due process. Sanders, who has served under Trump since 2017, said, "I have concluded that as a matter of conscience, I can no longer serve him or his administration." Later on, he wrote, "It's clear that its stated purpose notwithstanding, the executive order is nothing more than a smokescreen for what is clearly an attempt to require the political loyalty of those who advise the president, or failing that, to enable their removal with little if any due process." The FBI is sitting on a report detailing white supremacist terrorist threats, according to the Daily Beast. The FBI is 4 months late on releasing a legally required report detailing the activities of white supremacist groups, with suspicions arising that the director, Christopher Wray, is suppressing the report to help Trump as well as save his own job, as rumors swirl Wray would be first on the chopping block if Trump wins. Axios reported that CIA Director Gina Haspel and Defense Secretary Mark Esper are also reportedly going to get fired. Separately, the FBI warned that ransomware attacks are threatening the U.S. healthcare systems, according to credible information that they have. The DOJ charged 8 people in a plot to harass Chinese dissidents in the U.S. 5 were arrested inside the U.S., while the other 3 are believed to be in China. The New York City Fire Department's World Trade Center treatment program, meant to help firefighters that got cancer from cleaning up the 9/11 site, finally got their money back. The Trump administration was holding on to close to $3.4 million meant for the program, and Treasury Secretary Mnuchin even suggested New York City replace that money. It was only after Representative Peter King from Long Island got involved that apparently Mnuchin relented. The U.S. State Department confirmed this week that it would be pausing diversity training in accordance with President Trump's past executive order ending those programs. President Trump called diversity workplace training propaganda. Days after winning the 2016 election, Trump struck a deal with manufacturing company Carrier to save a factory in Indianapolis from outsourcing jobs. In exchange to keep 1,100 jobs, Indiana gave the company $7 million in tax incentives. The Washington Post reported that despite the deal, 17 Indiana factories outsourced so many jobs that it dwarfs the jobs Trump saved. Only 800 jobs ended up staying at the Carrier plant, with Carrier eliminating more than a couple thousand. NASA announced that water was discovered on the surface of the moon. The discovery has implications for future opportunities for astronauts to tap into the lunar planet's resources. Being able to use water as a resource, however, is yet to be understood. The Trump administration made the decision to open up all 9.3 million acres of the Tongass National Forest to logging and road building, presenting a catastrophic situation for the untouched wilderness. The move overturns protections put in place by Bill Clinton to prevent about 16.7 million acres over to development. Trump then on Thursday announced it was removing protections for gray wolves under the Endangered Species Act, ostensibly because the gray wolf population bounced back. The Treasury Department issued new sanctions against Iranian oil companies for supporting the elite military Quds Force. That's part of Trump's zero-tolerance policy when it comes to Iran. The U.S. and India signed a new defense cooperation treaty which would allow for more military information sharing. The U.S. is seeking an alliance with India to counter Chinese influence, especially in a time when India and China are flaring up their tensions. A U.S. citizen was kidnapped in the southern part of Niger, where Islamist terrorists are known to operate. The State Department is aware of the situation and are providing assistance, a spokesman said. And finally, in the last minute before we issue this recording, news broke that, moving on to Congress, Assemblywoman Nicole Malliotakis narrowly leads Congressman Max Rose in the race for Rose's congressional seat, according to an NBC4 Marist College poll. Among likely voters, 48% favor Malliotakis versus 46% for Rose. Rose was in videos this week engaging with voters, which included some cursing and shouting matches.
Your political career ends. Bro, I thought you were out of your mind either way, so don't worry. I am out of my mind.
The city profiled West Brighton, Staten Island, the Richmond County conclave that could possibly decide the election between Rose and Malliotakis. Trump's low poll numbers in Long Island might put 2 Republican seats in jeopardy. Representatives Lee Zeldin and Peter King might see themselves unseated. In December 2019, Democrat Jeff Van Drew, representative from New Jersey, made some headlines when he switched parties to become a Republican, made his way to the White House, and shook Trump's hand. Now, Van Drew is fighting to keep the seat he thought he could keep by making his daring move and swearing undying support for the president. Judge Amy Coney Barrett was confirmed to the Supreme Court on a straight party line vote, giving Republicans 6-3 control of the court. Democrats criticized Senate Republicans for rushing the process in the middle of a pandemic and weeks before Election Day. Barrett will be presiding over cases involving religious freedom and the Affordable Care Act shortly after her swearing in. Justice Clarence Thomas swore Barrett in Monday night, and Chief Justice Roberts swore Barrett in privately at Supreme Court chambers the next day.
I, Amy Coney Barrett, do solemnly swear
that I will support and defend the Constitution of the United States.
That I will support and defend the Constitution of the United States.
Against all enemies, foreign and domestic.
Against all enemies, foreign and domestic.
That I will bear true faith and allegiance to the same.
That I will bear true faith and allegiance to the same.
That I take this obligation freely.
That I take this obligation freely.
Without any mental reservation.
Without any mental reservation.
Or purpose of evasion.
Or purpose of evasion.
And that I will well and faithfully discharge.
And that I will well and faithfully discharge.
The duties of the office on which I am about to enter.
The duties of the office on which I am about to enter.
So help me God.
So help me God.
Politico came out with a piece positing which Democratic senators will potentially become the new chairs of the various committees in the Senate chamber. Bernie Sanders at Budget, Patrick Leahy at Appropriations, Dianne Feinstein at Judiciary, Sherrod Brown at Banking, Housing and Urban Affairs, Mark Warner at Intelligence, and Bob Menendez at Foreign Relations are Politico's bets. Rumors are swirling about Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell's health as pictures revealed his hands covered in bruises. McConnell wouldn't reveal any details about his health and insisted he's fine. South Carolina Senator Lindsey Graham and his Democratic challenger Jamie Harrison agreed to one final debate before Election Day. Two candidates are running neck and neck, but Graham is favored to eke out a win. A hearing was held in the Senate with three CEOs from Big Tech, Google's Sundar Pichai, Twitter's Jack Dorsey, and Facebook's Mark Zuckerberg. The hearing essentially involved Republican senators yelling at the tech CEOs for their ability to censor what they call conservative news, while tech CEOs defended their policies to prevent misinformation before the election. The law known as Section 230 was also brought up, which protects social media platforms from being sued for what is published on their platforms. Moving on to the judicial branch, the Supreme Court sided with Wisconsin Republicans seeking to stop a ballot deadline extension past Election Day. All ballots have to be received by 8 p.m. on Election Day in Wisconsin. Early voting could hit a record 100 million votes by Election Day. President Trump, along with North Carolina Republicans, petitioned the court for that state's ballot deadline case, but the court turned that challenge down. Justice Kavanaugh got some attention through his written opinion, first saying that fraud might occur by extending ballot deadlines, repeating false assertions of rampant voter fraud, and incorrectly citing a professor's argument which actually supported ballot deadline extensions. The concurring opinion got critics worried that there could be a repeat of the Bush v. Gore decision if the election results end up at the Supreme Court. Kavanaugh ended up correcting just a tiny piece of his opinion, but only to the part that claimed Vermont didn't change its election rules either. But that's only because Vermont complained. The Supreme Court allowed North Carolina to extend their deadline for receiving mail-in ballots to 5 p.m. on November 6th as long as they were postmarked by November 3rd. State Republicans suffered a loss this time around, with the plaintiff citing poor USPS delivery times. The High Court refused to expedite a case in an attempt to stop an extension of Pennsylvania's deadline for absentee ballots. Even though the case was the first one after the official swearing-in of Justice Barrett, she didn't have time enough to review the documents filed by the parties. The court has bounced around from agreeing to stop deadline extensions to letting them go on, in an attempt to not get involved with state election laws so close to the election. In Texas, District Judge Jason Pulliam struck down Governor Greg Abbott's order exempting requiring masks in polling places. The Texas NAACP sued the governor, saying that exempting masks can discriminate against Black and Latino voters because they would be forced to choose between their health and their right to vote. Minorities are more likely to get sick and die of coronavirus than white people. Turnout was already 58% of the 2016 total as of Friday. On Thursday, the 8th Circuit Court ruled in a 2-1 decision to set aside absentee ballots that arrive after 8 p.m. on Election Day in Minnesota, so it could be known what to do with them when a full panel decides how to handle them. The New York Times' Adam Liptak wrote about something all too common in Supreme Court rulings to emergency petitions, the lack of written opinions. One important example is the list of recent Election Day-related rulings which saw the court issue orders without stated reasons, with the public missing out on justifications as to why the court ruled a certain way. Keith Raniere, the leader of the sex cult NXIVM, spelled NXIVM, was sentenced to 120 years in prison in order to pay a $1.75 million fine by Brooklyn federal judge Nicholas Garofis for his role in being in charge of the group enslaving young women. Raniere would attract people, primarily young women, through self-help seminars, which transformed into horrific episodes where Raniere would physically brand people, participate in sex trafficking, and forced labor. Judge Lewis Kaplan of the Southern District of New York ruled against the Department of Justice's attempt to remove a case from New York State Court regarding the alleged rape of E. Jean Carroll by President Trump. Ms. Carroll alleges that Trump raped her in a department store changing room about 20 years ago, and Trump called her a liar. After that happened, the DOJ tried saying Trump made that statement in his official presidential capacity, justifying removal to federal court, where Carroll's defamation case would surely have failed, because federal employees acting in their official duties can't be sued for defamation. However, Judge Kaplan said that since the president isn't technically a federal employee who has anyone to answer to, he wasn't acting in his official capacity when he called Carroll a liar, and the case can't be removed to federal court. Ever since the Supreme Court's ruling allowing Trump's administration to stop the census count early, no other federal court in the country should continue the census case. So says the Department of Justice in court filings in the Northern District of California. Judge Lucy Coe presiding. A hearing is scheduled for next month in that court, and we'll see what Coe says about the DOJ's filings then. 12 years ago, the New York Times journalist David Rode was abducted in Pakistan and held in a Taliban compound. Rode made his escape to a Pakistani militia post and made it back. His abductor, Haji Najibullah, was finally arraigned on Wednesday in Federal District Court in Manhattan. 8 New York theaters are suing Governor Cuomo in Manhattan federal court, saying that COVID restrictions have been unfairly applied to their businesses and are destroying them. Other courts, in cases involving religious restrictions and business restrictions, have ruled in favor of the state government, saying that it had the authority to enact policies of public safety during the pandemic. Judge Emmett Sullivan, the same judge in the Michael Flynn case, had ordered USPS Postmaster Louis DeJoy to reverse changes he made to streamline the USPS. The D.C. District Judge wrote a detailed order granting an emergency motion to enforce and monitor compliance with reversing DeJoy's policies. And finally, in national news, corporate landlords have filed more than 10,000 eviction actions in 5 states between September to October 17th. If Congress doesn't pass relief by the end of the year, a record number of families may find themselves homeless. Oxford University's COVID vaccine is going well, with recent trials suggesting that the vaccine works with all ages. NBC News is reporting that infections are spreading across the country faster than since the start of the pandemic. The U.S. reported a record more than 500,000 COVID cases over the past week alone. The national case count surpassed 9 million on Thursday. The upcoming winter season poses a critical threat to the nation's hospitals, which are running out of beds. Walter Wallace Jr., a black man living in West Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, was shot and killed by police in the early hours of Tuesday this week. The 27-year-old Wallace Jr. was armed with a knife, which is why police were responding. Video shows police backing up from Wallace Jr. and shot him afterwards. Wallace Jr.'s mother was attempting to calm him down at the time before the shooting, and his family is asking why police didn't use tasers or other non-lethal methods before shooting him. Protests erupted shortly after news broke of Wallace's death, with the city instituting a curfew. The city let up that curfew a short while afterwards, and information was also revealed later on that said that Wallace's family called an ambulance because Wallace was having a mental health episode, but the police arrived first. Kyle Rittenhouse, the 17-year-old shooter that killed 2 protesters and shot a third during riots after the shooting of Jacob Blake, will be extradited to Wisconsin from Illinois, his home state. Illinois State Judge Paul Novak greenlighted the extradition after denying Rittenhouse's lawyer's request to set Rittenhouse free in Illinois. Hurricane Zeta formed this week, battering resorts in the Mexican Yucatan Peninsula, and hit the Gulf Coast on Wednesday as a Category 2. The storm killed 6, knocking out power to millions of people across the south. Wildfires on the West Coast continue as almost 100,000 people were instructed to evacuate in California. 2 firefighters were critically injured there. The LA Dodgers beat the Tampa Bay Rays to win the World Series for the first time since 1988. Yet that wasn't the biggest news to hit the pitch, as when the team went out to the field to celebrate, it was revealed that LA Dodger Justin Turner had coronavirus and was asked to isolate, and yet there he was on the field amongst his team, removing his mask later to kiss his wife, and then posing for a team photo alongside Dodgers manager Dave Roberts, who has Hodgkin lymphoma. And finally, the famous actor Sean Connery, who is known for his role as the first James Bond, passed away on Saturday at the age of 90. At first it wasn't clear what the cause of death was, but then it was revealed that he died in his sleep in the Bahamas. What a way to go, Mr. Connery. That's the end for our episode, our 10th episode for the week of October 25th. Look out for us on Facebook and other social media platforms with a live podcast covering election night results as they come in on Tuesday, November 3rd at 9 p.m. Me, Dennis Vittorian, I'll be there to answer any questions that our listeners can have. I'll also be there to set expectations for the night, because it's going to be a very busy night. And unless either candidate gets a complete wipeout of a number in the Electoral College, it looks like we will not be getting the results of the presidential election right then and there on Election Day. So, buckle in, ladies and gentlemen. You can always become a patron of ours on Patreon. Visit us on patreon.com/the25thhournews. Rate, subscribe, and share this podcast with your friends. The next time you'll hear this podcast, it'll be after November, after Election Day, and we will see you on November 8th. Thank you, and have a good rest of your weekend.
9 à la banque.
I need another 1,000.
I admire your courage, Miss...
Trench. Sylvia Trench. I admire your luck, Mr...
Bond. James Bond.
Mr. Bond, I suppose you wouldn't care to, raise the limit?
I have no objections.
C'est pas possible, madame. C'est illégal, monsieur.
No.
C'est suivi, monsieur.
Looks like you're out to get me.
It's an idea at that.